would be great.
Yeah.
And it's the big and everything.
Yeah, so ESN.
Especially if we could spread into that side.
ESN is on that. I already asked and told them we did everything.
Okay.
We got it, otherwise everything else is much more expensive, guys. If you have to
That's fine.
Yeah, let's see what happens.
Okay, that's great. Do I need to announce anything or say anything?
Our project is on Thursday, and I will send the post to got some of the exams, so everything should be okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay, great. So welcome everyone to the class. This is lecture number 3. And today we are going to talk about 2 topics, about network motifs, graphlets, and then the discovery of structural roles in networks. And essentially what we would like to do to kind of have an idea for this lecture is that we would like to think, rather than about entire graphs or entire networks, we would like to think about subnetworks. And essentially what we would like to say is, if I have a graph, what little pieces is it composed of? So essentially a good analogy is, if you have, I don't know, some structure built out of Legos, the question is, what kind of Legos is it built on, right? So we want to identify what are the Lego cubes that make the network, right? And this will allow us to kind of characterize the networks, discriminate between different types of networks, and it will also allow us to kind of describe the structure of the network around a given node, and this way gain insights into the networks themselves, right? So our goal will be to look at the subgraphs or subnetworks of a bigger network. And the idea is that we want to identify these building blocks, right? So here, what I'm trying to show you is this type of subgraph decomposition of an electronic circuit, right? So I'd like to identify this kind of small building blocks. And I will define them and we'll figure out how to identify them and so on. But that's the intuition what we'd like to do, okay? And the idea will be that we will take a big network and we will decompose it into a set of small structures. So what I want to show you here is that these structures will be relatively small. And here are all the possible graphs, directed graphs on 3 nodes. And there is 13 of them, right? So they are all connected, and they have a different number of edges. And in what they differ is what are the directions of these edges and how many edges there are. But you can see that all these graphs are distinct from each other, which means that these graphs are non-isomorphic. And I will give an example of a definition of what isomorphic means. But essentially, 2 graphs are isomorphic if they are the same graph, they're just drawn in a different way, right? If I can kind of map nodes of one graph to another graph, and the edges are the same and in the same directions, then 2 graphs are isomorphic, okay? So that is what we will try to do. So we will try to take a large network and then in some sense represent it using some kind of frequencies or counts or some kind of statistic of how many of each of these pieces is it composed of. And these pieces can be of size 3, that's kind of the first non-trivial case. They can be of size 4, size 5, and so on. But just for illustration, these are all the subgraphs, connected non-isomorphic subgraphs on 3 nodes and arbitrary number of edges, right? That's the simplest one. Notice how this, for example, how these differ in the edge directions. And here is the last one that is essentially a fully connected graph with all the edges being bidirectional, right? And for example, I don't know, the difference between this one is a loop, and then this one is not a loop, but is this kind of feed-forward loop, and so on. Right, like you can go here, and then go up, and that's different than this guy because this is a loop, right? So you see how these graphs are different, right? So what will we do? The idea will be the following. we will take this, for each of these subgraphs, imagine you have some kind of metric capable of telling us whether the frequency or occurrence of that subgraph in the network is significant. And we will have these two notions in some sense of significance. The significance value can be positive or can be negative. And the way we will interpret these values is that negative value will mean that this particular pattern is underrepresented, and a positive value will mean that this particular pattern is overrepresented in a network, right? And then for a given network, we can create a significance profile where for every of the possible subgraphs, the 13 subgraphs on the previous slide, we will have a number that tells us whether that particular substructure is overrepresented or underrepresented. All right? And what I will show you next is that already just looking at the frequency or these significance profiles of different networks, we can distinguish networks coming from different domains. So what I'll show you is gene regulatory networks, so networks coming from biology, networks of neurons, so real neurons in real organisms, how they connect to each other, example of an information network of the World Wide Web, a social network, and networks that you can create out of text and language by linking adjacent words and so on. And so these are the different classes of networks. So what am I showing you here? These are the 13 different subgraphs on 3 nodes directed with a different number of edges. And then I have 4 different kind of plots because I have 4 different types of networks: gene regulatory networks, web and social, and language networks. And then for each of these, the y-axis is my significance profile, right? So the way to read this would be to say, for this particular substructure, this is kind of overrepresented in language, but it's kind of underrepresented in web and social graphs. It's underrepresented in neural networks, and it's underrepresented in gene regulatory networks, right? While, for example, this type of structure number 10 is slightly underrepresented in language networks, overrepresented in web and social, very significantly overrepresented in neurons, and kind of at 0, which means not underrepresented in gene regulatory networks. And what you can see from this is that each line here is a different graph, because here we have 4 or 5 different graphs, and you see how they nicely follow each other, even though one graph is from English, the other one is from Spanish, Japanese, and so on. Or for example, here you can see that web graphs and social networks kind of share this significance profile quite well. And you can see, again, networks of neurons from different organisms, again, have quite similar profiles. Okay? So now this is what these types of profiles teach us, or what can we see from them. What we are going to do next is we will go through and learn how do we compute this. What is this really? Like, how do we define things, and how would we go and compute this and do this kind of experiment ourselves? Okay, so there is 3 things we will do today. First, we will talk about subgraphs, and we will define a notion of network motif, and we will define a notion of graphlet. And then I'll talk about algorithms to find motifs and graphlets. Then, using these types of concepts, we will talk about how do we discover structural roles of nodes in the network. And then I'll show you some applications of these things. Okay, so that's the plan for today. So first is about motifs and structural roles in networks. Okay, so a network motif, so this is now a definition, is a significant recurring pattern of interconnections in the network. So in order to define a network motif, we need to break down that vague definition above. First, we need to define what do we mean by a pattern. By a pattern, we mean small induced subgraph. Okay? Induced means if you have a set of nodes, then you take all the edges between that set of nodes. Okay? Recurring means that it occurs multiple times, right, with high frequency. And then significant means it's more frequent than expected. And whenever you say that something is significant or more frequent than expected, then you need some kind of null model, right? If you think about the last lecture, we were talking about the random graph model and whether we should be surprised about diameter and clustering. Here we also need some kind of baseline above which we will then measure is something more expressed or less expressed than what we expected. So I'll talk to you about how do we generate random graphs that give us that baseline to then assess significance, okay? So the question is, why do we need these substructures? Why do we need motifs, right? And here I'm trying to show you some examples of different types of motifs in pictures. But essentially, motifs help us understand how networks work. They help us understand how networks are kind of composed together. And they allow us to predict operation or reaction of a network to a given situation, right? And here, as I say, are a few different examples of these types of motifs, right? Feed-forward loops, this would be a feed-forward loop, right? From X, you can go through Y to Z, or you can go directly from X to Z. This is called a feed-forward loop, and it's found in networks of neurons where they basically neutralize biological noise. And if you think about neural networks, these are skip connections, right? Think about ResNet. ResNet has skip connections, right? So nature has skip connections as well, right? Then parallel loops are, for example, these types of structures. These happen a lot in nature, where you can create food webs, which basically means is who's feeding on whom, right? It's like animal Y is eating an animal is eating an animal X, and animal W is eating or preying on both Y and Z. So you will have a lot of these types of structures where two different species have a common food source, and two of them are both a food source for a common predator, right? And similarly, for example, you can have in many gene control networks, you kind of have this kind of single input modules where however you change whatever happens to X, it kind of gets propagated to many other nodes. And these are just some examples of these types of structures. So now what I want to define is this notion of an induced subgraph, right? So we are given a motif of interest. Imagine this kind of little graph on 3 nodes and 2 directed edges. And then if I go into my network, I want to say, where all does this type of subgraph appear? And for example, here is an occurrence of this subgraph, right? If I take these 3 nodes, then they are connected exactly in the pattern of the motif of interest, right? But for example, this guy is not a match. And the reason why this set of 3 nodes does not match that motif is because this is not an induced subgraph. By induced, it means I have to take all the edges between the 3 nodes. And you notice that here is one edge that is missing in my pattern. So this is not an instance of my pattern. While here, I take all the edges between the 3 nodes, and they match exactly the structure I'm interested in, right? So what this slide illustrates is this notion of an induced subgraph, where an induced subgraph of a graph is a graph formed from a given subset of nodes, and all of the edges connecting pairs from that subset, right? Including this edge. That's why this is not an instance, because this is an instance of a different motif. This is an instance of a feed-forward loop, and not this kind of chain of length 2. Okay? So this is in terms of defining an induced subgraph. Now, the second thing, we need to define the notion of occurrence. And the notion of occurrence is such that we allow for overlaps. And the best way to illustrate this, if this is my motif of interest, and this is a toy graph, then in this graph, my motif of interest occurs 4 times, right? The reason why it occurs 4 times is because we have this bidirectional rectangle here, and then we have one outgoing edge from the rectangle, right? So this is one instance of the motif, this is another instance of the motif, that's another one, and that's another one, right? So there are 4 instances of our motif of interest in this graph, okay? So we allow motifs to overlap, but not to be exactly the same, okay? So this is now what we defined so far is this notion of an induced subgraph, and we defined a notion of an occurrence or an instance of a pattern in the graph, in the network. Okay? So these are the two. Now we need to define this notion of significance. So that's the next concept we are going to define. And when we think about significance, here is how we think about it. The key idea is to compare the frequency, the number of occurrences of a given motif of interest in our network versus in some kind of random realizations of the network, right? So if this is my real graph and this is my motif of interest, the feed-forward loop, here with red edges, all the instances of that feed-forward loop are illustrated, and here are some notion of randomized networks, randomized graphs, and here again with red edges, instances of this motif are tried to be illustrated. And what should kind of become clear from this picture is that there is a lot of instances of the motif in this graph, but there is very few instances of the motif in this randomized version of the graph. So our conclusion would be that this motif is overrepresented or overexpressed in the target network when compared to some kind of null model random networks. Okay? So let me now tell you how do you compute this significance. And significance is essentially just a z-score. It's essentially the difference in occurrence normalized by some natural variability of that motif in the network. So the idea is the following. I will say that the motif is overrepresented in a network when I'm kind of comparing it to its count or frequency in the random network. So, and this notion of a z-score captures the statistical significance of motif I. And z-score can be positive or negative. And the way you compute it is you say z-score of motif I is the number of times motif I appears in a real network minus the average number of times this motif I appears in a randomized version of that same network divided by the standard deviation of the number of motif instances across this ensemble of random networks. Okay? So n real is the number of subgraphs of type I in the real network, n random is the number of subgraphs in the random network, and then the z-score is the difference where this is average over all the instances of random graphs, and this is a standard deviation over all the instances of a random graph. So essentially, I'm measuring the difference in the units of standard deviation. Okay? And then the way they define network significance profile, you can see that this was, I think, first done by biologists because they take these z-scores and they normalize them so that they have length 1, which is kind of a bit funny, but they are who they are, right? So that's how they do it, right? So essentially, you take these z-scores and you normalize it such that the sum of the squares of z-scores equals to 1, all right? So that Euclidean length of this significance profile vector equals to 1. That's essentially what this normalization does, okay? And this is it. Right? So now we know how to compute the significance profile. The only thing we don't know yet is how this random graph is being generated. Right? We need a null model. We need a model to generate these random graphs. And the question is, what is a good null model, or what kind of null model should we use? And once we have the null model, we can generate multiple instances of the random graph, compute the number of occurrences of our subgraph I in the random graph, compute the average, compute the standard deviation, and we get the z-score, and then we just normalize the z-scores, and here is our profile. Okay? So what I will tell you next is how do we generate that random graph. Okay? Everyone happy so far? Anyone has questions, doubts? Anything? So everyone's happy? All right, good. You are not unhappy if you ask a question. Sorry if that might be implied. All right, so what do we want to do? We want to generate random graphs, okay? And in particular, what we did last lecture, we talked about the Erdos-Renyi random graph model, this simplest possible thing. Yes?
Do you have a question?
Yes.
I'm just a little curious as to how you distinguish between recurring and significant, because they both deal with frequency. One is very frequent and one is more frequent than expected. And that's, to me, not mutually exclusive.
Great question. Why do we, so the question in some sense is, why don't I work with real counts and why do I kind of compute this significance? Oh yeah, slide 10, but I'll explain it here.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so the point is the following. These networks, the occurrence, the number of times a motif occurs will depend a lot on the size of the network, right? Bigger networks should have more instances of the motif, and it will also kind of depend a bit on the density of the network. So the reason why we compute significance this way, because it kind of abstracts that away, right? It kind of says, however big is your network, we will consider that. However dense your network is, the random part will kind of try to subtract that out. So we are really interested, is it kind of more or less than what we would expect, where if you see that something occurs a lot, it's not clear because it really occurs a lot, or maybe the graph is super big and it really occurs little for the size of that graph, but still the absolute number is large. So we normalize it this way.
Filter out these random graphs, I would say.
Exactly. Because the absolute number is not so meaningful, this is more meaningful because it's kind of normalized.
Got it.
All
Thank
right?
you,
Great question. Thank you for asking it. Actually, super awesome. Okay, so now I need that random graph. So the intro to this is, we already know how to generate these Erdos-Renyi random graphs, and those are really cool, and Erdos is a very cool guy, but it's kind of the simplest possible way. So what we want to do here is we want to generate a random graph that's a bit more tailored to or similar to the real graph as well. And one way to do this is to say, I want to have a random graph where I have the same number of nodes, I have the same number of edges, and also every node has the same degree as in the original graph. So what our goal now is to generate a random graph that captures more properties of the real graph. And the properties we want to capture is number of nodes, total number of edges, and we also want to capture the degree distribution or the degree sequence of the nodes in the real graph. So the way we can think of this is, our goal is to generate a random graph with a given degree sequence, right? Node 1 will have degree k1, node 2 will have degree k2, and so on. And let's say that this degree sequence comes to us from somewhere. Essentially, this degree sequence we can take from this G real, right? Let's say the degree sequence comes from the real graph. And now the way we will do this is we will use this as a null model, and we will then count the occurrences of the motif in this random graph that have the same number of nodes, same number of edges, and the same degree sequence as the real graph. And the model that we will use is called configuration model. And here's a very easy way how to generate this. Essentially what we will do is we will think that we have the nodes, and each node has a given degree. And we will think that these nodes have these degrees, that basically they have these spokes, these half edges. And all we have to do now is we have to connect these half points, these half edges with each other to get now a random graph. Okay? And the way a way how to do this is the following. You can essentially generate this. If you have 4 nodes on the left, you generate this kind of 4 partitions where the number of nodes in every partition is exactly the degree of that node. Okay, so I have node A has degree 3, so it gets 3 little circles. And then what I can do is, now I can just think of this as a set of nodes, and I generate a random graph between that set of nodes. Okay? And now what do I do is I can collapse these sets of nodes into single nodes, and there is an edge between a pair of partitions if any of the edges inside, if there is at least one of the edges across the partitions, right? So from this type of thing, here is the graph we would generate, right? So nodes A and B are connected because there are 2 edges. Nodes A and C are connected because there is an edge, okay? So this is a very quick and efficient way to generate these types of graphs. Let me answer because I know your question, right? So your question is likely that here, for example, right, I want to have node A to have degree 3, node C to have degree 2, and node B to have degree 4. And because I have this double edge here, the node B doesn't have degree 4 as I wanted, but it had degree 3, right? That's your question? Okay, great, that's good. Right? So, and yes, this is a problem, and this type of graph generation ignores that problem, but you can, basically, what has been shown both empirically and mathematically is these types of bad events are exponentially rare. So essentially, whatever you will generate here, and if this thing is big enough, it will be exactly what we wanted plus a bit of noise. So for large graphs, even though you may have issues, it is not a problem, right? The issues are that you have multiple edges, or that you would kind of connect nodes inside the same partition. That can happen as well. And that can be modeled as a self-loop. Yes?
Does it matter that we've lost any sort of sense of local structure, or is that intentional?
That's intentional. Exactly. We kind of lost the local structure, right? So that's a good observation. But this is what people call a configuration model, and essentially the goal here is to generate a random graph with a given degree sequence. And this will generate you approximately a random graph with approximately this degree sequence that you wanted, right? And sometimes what is the problem here is that double edges and self loops are kind of ignored when we are creating the graph. Now, yes?
Why not go through the nodes one by one and connect them directly?
Great. So the question is, why not go over nodes one by one and connect them to other nodes? If you do that, then your graph will not be random, right? The reason why it won't be random, because whoever you start with, they will get a chance to link. And at the end, you may be left out with a node that has the spokes, but cannot find anyone else to connect to, right? So what we would like to do is, out of all the graphs that satisfy these constraints, we'd like to have a random one. And if you would do this in any kind of preset order, you wouldn't generate a random graph from this distribution of graphs with this type of degree sequence. So this truly gives you a random graph from the set of graphs with these types of degree sequence. Why it wouldn't be able to connect with other nodes? Because you would run out of spokes. Right? If you play with this, there is only a subset of graphs that satisfies that all these edges are connected properly, right? And if you now process them in some order, you will be able maybe to exhaust 90% of the spokes, but then you'll be left with a node and it has 3 spokes out. And there's nothing you can do with it, right? That will be the problem. Happy to talk more offline. Yes?
In this example, it's undirected, but for a directed graph, would you have in spokes and out spokes?
Great. For directed graphs, you could think of it as having in and out spokes. And then you'd have to be more careful here how would you do that, right? But you would probably, I think what you'd need is you need to have kind of 2 super nodes, A in and A out, and then connect things. That's a good point, okay? But if you guys are worried, let me continue and maybe I'll ask your question as well, okay? So there's another way how you can do this. And this is now a much more expensive way, but really keeps the graph to have exactly the same degree sequence and everything. And the way the idea is here is that you will pick a random pair of edges and you will cross them. Okay? So the idea is, imagine I pick edges A, B, and C, D. What I do now is I cross their endpoints. Right? So now B links to C and A links to D. Right? So I took these 2 edges and I crossed them, right? And what you can also show is that if you do this crossing long enough, the graph you will get will also be a random graph that will obey a given degree sequence, right? So here we are given a degree sequence. I pick a random pair of edges and I cross them, which means that basically I swap the endpoints. And this means that all the nodes keep the same degrees, just the graph gets a bit more random. And if I repeat this about 100 times number of edges, so quite a long times, then the graph I would get is a random graph with a given degree sequence, right? The complexity of this thing is this is far slower process than this previous one that I was showing you that does this approximately, where you just pick random pairs, connect them, and you have the graph. Here, we have to do this rewiring, have to do it long time, but if you do it long time, you will get a random graph. Yes.
Converging on one particular graph, or is it just people deciding to converge random?
So so if you run this long time, you can show that this thing will converge. So if you stop it at some random time, you will get a random graph from the family of graphs with a given degree sequence. You can keep running it as long. It will never converge, right? Because it's always randomly kind of changing something. But the point is, it will converge to a uniform sample from a distribution of graphs with a given degree sequence. Yes?
So when you're coming up with a null graph, like how do you argue that it's like close enough to the original graph that it counts as a fair comparison? So for example, like we didn't stop at just same number of nodes, same number of edges. If we went to say that it has to have the same degree sequence too.
Great. So maybe I should be repeating questions, but this is an excellent question. So the question is, when do you know a null model is a good enough model, right? And it really depends on your question and what are you trying to do. So it's both kind of a modeling question, but it's also kind of a science question. What is your underlying question, right? And what we did here is we kept the number of nodes, number of edges, and the number of connections every node has to match between the real graph and the random graph. Like the next thing would be to say, oh, I also want to match the number of triangles. But then you have to ask yourself, why would I want to do that? And is this important for the question I'm trying to answer or for the task I'm doing? And that really depends on the task, right? Of course, the other thing that is true is the more of these higher order structures you want to match, the harder these things become, right? Here, we just added the degrees, and it's already kind of getting tricky, as you can see. All right, great point, yes?
I just want to ask about this. One extreme case could be the original graph that we have doesn't have any of that kind of pattern, linkage pattern in itself. Then in that case, this kind of techniques cannot work.
Great, so the question was that our original graph would have no type of patterns like this. I think the only graph that would have no patterns like this would be a star, right? So if you have a star graph, you have a guy in the center and it has all of these edges. But then if you say, how many graphs are there where all the nodes have degree 1 and one node has degree n minus 1, there's only a star graph. So you wouldn't randomize anything, but because the distribution, the number of different graphs with that degree sequence is that there is only one such graph, right? So yes, if you are, when you pick a random pair of edges, they may collide like this, then there's nothing for you to do. You reject and you sample again, okay? But that's still, it's still good. You get a random sample from a distribution with one instance. So you always get the same thing, which is like perfect, all right? Good, thank you very much for the questions. So now I showed you how essentially we can do this, right? The way we generate this plot is, we take the real graph, we will count the motifs, we generate random graphs, let's say using this edge switching method. For every random graph, we compute how many instances of that motif we have, we compute the average, we compute the standard deviation over these random graphs, and compute the z-score, and then the z-scores here are normalized in such a way that some of their squares should sum to 1. And that's essentially what this is, okay? And what is impressive here is that you can take very different networks, and different class of networks has a different profile, a different description, okay? So to conclude, to recap, we will take a real graph, we will compute the number of instances of subgraph I in them. Then we will use this switching model or the configuration model to create many random instances of that graph. And then we will compute the z-score as I explained. And if the z-score absolute value is high, which means highly negative or highly positive, then we will say that this subgraph is a motif. It's kind of highly over or underrepresented subgraph for a given network, okay? And then this is the, wow, yes, go.
How to ensure that we generate enough number of random subgraphs that we get the correct value of z?
Great, so the question is, how many random graphs do you need to generate? These counts will generally be large and quite, many times similar because graphs are big. So how many would you take here? The question is, how many do you need to estimate this part well? Generally, 100,000, 10,000. Okay, but some more than 10.
Does it depend upon the number of nodes present in the graph? Like order of magnitude related to the order of magnitude of the number.
It will depend. It will depend on the size of the real graph, and and I think the smaller it will be, the bigger these variances and deviations will be. Okay, so that's good. Thank you. So just to say that this is just the first kind of dive into this topic, and there is like gazillion of papers that take this basic idea and expand it in many different directions, right? We talked about you can expand this to directed motifs, you can expand this to undirected motifs, you can think of nodes as colored or non-colored, so you could imagine some colors of nodes, and now two subgraphs are different if the colors don't match. You can also think about some kind of temporal motifs where edges may have times associated with them, and now a motif is defined as a sequence that occurs in a given time interval. You can think about also variations of this concept in terms of how do we capture the notion of frequency. There are many different significance metrics. You can also think about motifs that are underrepresented, but what I mean that is you can think of them as anti-motifs, is something that does not occur, but its complements tend to occur. And you can also think about using different null models to compute these z-scores, right? So there is a huge body of work that goes in these different directions using essentially the concepts or extending the concepts that I presented. So if you are kind of interested in any of these things, happy to point you to papers. And there's a lot of research on this topic. Some of them we even did in our group a few years ago. Okay? So that's what I wanted to say about network motifs. So I'll skip this. And then what I want to now do next is to talk about extension of network motifs that are called graphlets. And network motifs we used to characterize the entire network. Now we will use this notion of graphlets to characterize a given node. Okay, so we will try to describe the network structure around a given node, right? So again, before we talked on full networks and tried to say what is the network made of, now we are looking at one node and say how does the neighborhood of the node around the node look like? And this neighborhood will be captured by this concept of a graphlet. Okay? So here is what graphlets are. They are connected non-isomorphic subgraphs, and they are induced subgraphs of any frequency. And the point is that here, these subgraphs will be rooted at a given node. So what does this mean is the following. Like the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, this shows the number of different graphlets. And what I want to show you here is, for example, for this chain of two nodes, you have two non-isomorphic positions in this graph. You can be at the beginning of the chain, or you can be in the middle of the chain, and those are different, right? For example, if you are part of triangle, you can be at any of the corners of the triangle. They are all symmetric, so it doesn't really matter, right? For example, if you are part of a chain, if you are a node and you are in the network and you are part of a chain of 4 nodes, you can either be the first element in the chain or you can be the second element in the chain. If you are third, it's the same as being second, right? So here, again, you have two positions that you distinguish, right? Or for this G4, again, you have two positions. If you have this, I don't know, Mercedes sign or whatever, you can be in the center or you can be in the periphery, right? If you are part of the square, again, it doesn't matter which corner of the square you are, they are all the same, right? And so on and so forth, right? So now what we will essentially do is to say, if I'm a node, I will look at the structure of the network around me, and then I will say, aha, I'm part of this type of motif. Where am I? Which position am I in this motif? And I can be at the beginning, I can be at position 2, I can be in the middle, right? And then if I'm here, it's the same as 16. Okay, so what this means is that these are all 5-node graphlets, and there is 72 of them. You see that as I increase the size of the graph, the number of graphlets also increases, right? So for 3 nodes, for 3 nodes I should have 2. For 4 nodes I should have 16. For 5 nodes I should have 21. And for 10 nodes I should have whatever is this big number, right? So this blows up very quickly. So we are usually interested in up to 5, maybe 6 node size graphlets. So with this basic idea, let me now explain a bit more how this graphlets business works. Okay, so these graphlets are used to obtain a node level representation, right? So this is kind of a node level subgraph metric. If motifs are the entire network subgraph metric, this is a per node or node level subgraph metric. And essentially one way you can think of it is that this is a generalization of a concept of a degree of a node, which is the number of adjacent edges to the node, right? So degree is the number of edges that a given node touches. And the idea is that graphlets are generalization of this, where the graphlet degree vector counts the number of graphlets that a given node touches, right? And if we go back to the previous picture with this concept, then it's clear that for this type of subgraph, I can touch it at 3 different points, right? And this particular subgraph I can touch at 4 different points, right? That are non-isomorphic or distinguishable from each other. Okay, so that's some intuition how to think of this. And then what I have to explain is this notion of an automorphism orbit, right? I was talking about isomorphisms, which are isomorphisms between different objects, and automorphisms are isomorphisms between the same object. You can think of it that way, right? So automorphism orbit takes into account the symmetries in a given subgraph, right? So graphlet degree vector is a vector where the frequency at a given position tells me how many times the node is at that orbit position. So let me give you an example. If this is my input graph, here are the graphlets on 2 and 3 nodes. So here would be now my graphlet degree vector, right? So for node of interest V, I say in how many graphlets of type A does it participate in? It participates here and here, so that's 2. Then I say in how many graphlets of type B does it participate? Here it is, it's 1, right? Here's the triangle. But then if I ask how many graphlets of this type does it participate, I need to ask at what orbit position does my node of interest participate? Is it at this position or is it at that position? So for the orbit C, the instance of it is here. The instance of it would be here, but because, again, this is defined as induced subgraph, I have this edge too much, so my node V does not participate at orbit C in this type of graphlet. But if now I look at the orbit D, then I see 2 instances of it, right? Here and here, right? And that's why I have a count of 2. And here are examples that of those instances from here. Yes?
Why does A only appear twice?
Sorry?
Why does A only appear twice?
Why does A appear twice? Because this node has degree 2.
Oh, it's only for that vertex.
It's only for a vertex, right? This is now node level. It's not graph level. Yes?
Why does A only appear? Oh no, D appear only twice. Shouldn't it appear 4 times?
Why should D appear 4 times? It's 1 and 2.
So the middle edge doesn't count.
So you mean this?
Yeah.
No, because then you have to take that edge as well, because it's induced. Okay? So it participates in one triangle, which is here, right? That's why, for example, by your argument, then it should participate once in the orbit C. But it doesn't because, again, I get this edge. Okay, yes?
How do you choose to make it participate in B versus twice in C? Do we not get to, for example, choose to make it not participate in one triangle versus another?
I'm not sure. So the point is, I have orbits, and the orbit has to match on the given vertex of interest as an induced subgraph. If that doesn't make sense, let's talk offline. Okay? So now I showed you how to generate this graphlet degree vector for a given vertex, right? And then graphlet degree vector gives me the counts of number of graphlets that the node touches at a particular orbit. And generally what people consider is these graphlets of size 2 to 5 nodes, which means that every node gets described with 73 coordinates, or with a vector of 73 numbers, and this is a signature that essentially tells me in what graphlet at what orbit does a given node participate at, and this means that we are essentially describing the structure of the network around the node up to 4 hops away. Okay, essentially this graphlet degree vector provides us a measure or characterization of nodes' local network topology. And just to kind of clear out any confusions, what I want to show here is now for a different graph, this is its graphlet degree vector of length 72. And here are different examples of instances of a given graphlet and orbit for the node A, right? And for example, I try to illustrate the instances of those orbits and the graphlets that are counted at a given position, right? And now what we can do is we can now use this vector to do various different things with our nodes. And what I will show next is what can we do with these types of feature vectors or descriptors of nodes. But before I do that, I need to tell you, how do you compute this? How do you find motifs and how do you find graphlets, right? How would you computationally do and identify these things? So that's what we'll do next, and then the last part of the lecture, I'll talk about applications. Okay? So if we want to find these motifs and graphlets, we need to solve 2 challenges. The first challenge is that we want to find all the size k, where k is a parameter. Think 3, 4 size subgraphs in the network. And first we need to enumerate all of them, and then we need to count them. So there are 2 steps. One is enumerating, which essentially means find all the instances, and then you need to count the number of number of instances of each structure. And this is a very hard computational problem, and it's shown to be NP complete. So for these reasons, these motifs or graphlets or subgraphs are usually considered only up to a few nodes, 5, 6, maybe 8 at most, because then the combinatorial explosion is too large, right? And as I said, computational time grows exponentially with the size of the motif. So really, we can only count this and enumerate motifs up to a given size, kind of a handful of nodes. I will only present here a very kind of simple baseline algorithm how to do these things, but there is really a lot of research in this area, and it's a very active research area right now, where essentially people are thinking about what are efficient ways to do this counting, enumeration, maybe approximate counting, approximate enumeration. What we want to do is enumerate, which basically means find all the instances, and once we have all the instances, we want to count, basically identify isomorphic instances and count all of them together. So this is what we are going to look at, and we will look at one algorithm that's called ESU algorithm. This was done 2006 was, I think, the publication. Okay? So the way this works, this is called ESU algorithm for exact subgraph enumeration. And this will be a recursive algorithm where we will have 2 sets. We will have a subgraph that we have built so far, and we will then have a set of nodes that will tell us where can we go and extend this subgraph. Okay, so we will be building this V subgraph from 1 node to 2 nodes, 3 nodes, and so on. And V subgraph will be it will be the subgraph we have already built, and V extension will be a set of nodes to which we can further extend this subgraph to make it 1 node bigger. And the idea will be the following. Here's the main idea for the algorithm. We will start at some node V, and then we will add new nodes U to the extension set, such that these nodes U have 2 properties. First, U's node ID must be greater than that of node V. The reason we have this condition is because we don't want to generate the same graph multiple times. And then the other thing will be that node U can only be a neighbor of some newly added node W, but not of any node that is already in V subgraph, right? So we want to only extend the subgraph we have built so far. And given these rules, the ESU algorithm can be implemented in a recursive fashion where basically the running the function can be displayed in a tree-like structure of depth k, and this tree-like structure will be called ESU tree, and I will show you an example. So first I'll give you the pseudocode, and it will be a bit scary, but bear with me. Okay? So this is the pseudocode, and I have 2 functions. The first function will say, let's extend a subgraph at a given vertex V. So for every vertex, I will say, let's start expanding a subgraph from here. And then this is a recursive function that extends the subgraph and keeps extending it until either I cannot extend it anymore, or the graph that I have built is of the size k, and I terminate. Right? I keep extending until I found the graph of size k, which is the size I care about. I keep extending either until I build big enough graph or until there is nowhere for me to extend. And the way this will work is that given that the subgraph I have built so far, which at the first iteration will be just a single node V, and a set of nodes to which we can extend, we will essentially go and say, let's pick an arbitrary node from this extension, let's add it into our subgraph, and let's update our extension set and run the same routine again. Okay? And all we have to be careful is about how this extension set is maintained and how do we extend it. And the important rule here is that the node IDs of the nodes that we add into extension set can only be bigger than the node IDs of the nodes from which we started building the graph. So this is how much I'm going to say about this pseudocode. To give you an example how this works, I want to show you kind of one run of this algorithm. So this is now this recursive subtree where every level means a recursive call of our extend subgraph function, right? So here on the left is the graph on 5 nodes with node IDs. And then here is the first level is essentially, I show you 2 things. I show you V subgraph and V extension. And the property here is that V subgraph is the first node, second node, third node, fourth node, fifth node. So this corresponds to basically this for loop. Okay? And now at everyone, I have built subgraph of size 1 with node 1 in it. And then the V extension are all the neighbors of node 1 that have ID greater than 1. So node 3. For example, when I built a subgraph out of node 3, I'm only allowed to take neighbors who have ID greater than 3. So this would be nodes 4 and 5. So there it is. And then, for node 5, there are no neighbors that have ID greater than 5. So V extension is bigger, so nothing happens here. Okay? So now that I'm here, I say, okay, let's add node number 3 into my subgraph, and let's compute the new extension. And the new extension set would now be the neighbors of node 3 that are not part of the current subgraph, and that have IDs greater than 1. So this would be 2, 4, and 5, right? And now I'm here and I say, let me take number 2, put it into my extension, into my subgraph. I notice that now I have 3 nodes and I terminate. So I have generated this subgraph. And then, I take the second one. I have 1, 3, and 4. And this is 1, 3, and 4. And then I take 1, 3, and 5. Again, I have a subgraph of size 3. And again, I terminate, right? I could keep extending, but because my subgraph is of the size I care about, which is 3, I stop, okay? So this means here I generated the 3 instances of subgraphs of size 3. Then from this guy, I generate the other 2, right? And then from this one, I generate the last one, which is 3, 4, and 5, right? So this is how now I generated all the instances of node 3 subgraphs that appear in my target graph, right? And the important thing is that essentially what I have is this V subgraph that is the subgraph I have built so far. I have this V extension that gives me the candidates to which I can create an extension. And at every iteration, I essentially take this thing, move it across, and ask myself, do I have big enough subgraph, or do I need to keep it growing? And this is kind of the recursive tree of how this algorithm would work. And whenever I generate a graph of size k, I just return it and pop up a level and do another kind of step in the recursion. Okay? So now what we have done is for a given k, which is in our case was k3, we have generated all the subgraphs, all connected induced subgraphs on 3 nodes. So these are all the instances of different subgraphs. What we have to do next is we have to count them. Okay? What this means is that these are undirected graphs on 3 nodes. So really, there are only 2 graphs, 2 different non-isomorphic graphs on 3 nodes, a chain and a triangle. So if the first part was enumeration, we have enumerated the graphs. Now we need to count them, which basically means that there are, from here we say that there are, okay, yes, I know how to count. There are 4 instances of a chain on 3 nodes, and there is 1 instance of a triangle, right? And what is the point here? The point here is that you see that all these graphs are isomorphic to this one. So this should have a count of 5, and that guy is different, so it should have a count of 1, okay? So far I told you how to enumerate. Now I want to do this counting step. And the way you do the counting step is the following, is that what we have to do is we have to take these instances of subgraphs and we have to identify them and kind of classify them into non-isomorphic graphs of size k. And the idea is that we determine which subgraphs in the ESU tree leaves are basically topologically equivalent or isomorphic, and group all of them together and count them together. There is many different algorithms to do that. One of very famous and still very fast is kind of a algorithm called NOTI. And I will just show you how you would in principle do that. But what you do is you use this algorithm from 80s because it's really full of really good heuristics how to speed this up. But just to define what subgraph isomorphism is, sorry, you had a question.
It actually goes back to this question. So now that you're creating paths, so the only time branches matter when you're trying to distinguish between isomorphic subgraphs are when they're at the beginning and at the end. Is that correct?
I'm not sure what you are asking.
So this example here, I would say, so you have 1, 3, and 4, the second graph on the left. So 3 has technically an edge going to 5, but we don't consider that.
Correct, because that's a different motif. Of course, we also consider 4, 3, 5, which should be here, right?
So if there is an extra edge connecting to another node at the end to create.
It's an induced subgraph, right? It's an induced subgraph. So I have to take all the edges that come between those 3 nodes, right? So if I go back, right, here, like, you know, it's 1, 2, 3. Here is the induced subgraph, right? It's 1, 3, 4. It's an induced subgraph. But when I come to 3, 4, 5, I take all the edges between 3, 4, 5, right? But for example, notice that I never generated 2, 4, 5, right? 2, 4, 5 wouldn't be a connected graph. So my procedure never even generates or considers 2, 4, 5. Okay, great question. Anything else? All right. Good. So all I want to show you is what's the problem of graph isomorphism. The problem of graph isomorphism is essentially the following, right? If I will say that graphs G and H are isomorphic, if there exists a mapping from one graph to the other so that all the edges match, right? So the idea is that if I have this bijective function f that takes the vertices of graph V and maps them to the vertices of graph H in such a way that if U and V are connected in G, then f of U and f of V are also connected in H, right? Pictorially, I have a graph here. This is my graph G. Here is my graph H. And the question is, are these two graphs isomorphic, right? Can I map the nodes from this graph kind of on top of the nodes of this graph, and then all G edges will map, right? Wherever this graph has an edge, this graph will also have an edge, and the other way around. If there's an edge here, there should be an edge there, right? So what I'm trying to do is I try to find this mapping between nodes in one graph and nodes in the other graph, and if I'm able to find a mapping where these graphs kind of directly align, then these two graphs are isomorphic, right? So this case is hard to show you that this is non-easy, but if I go back to this case, right, I can take this graph and that graph and say, are they isomorphic, right? If I take this thing and you know, map 1 to 4, 3 to 3, and 2 to 1, then the two graphs match perfectly, right? But these two guys are not isomorphic because, you know, I can map 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and 5 to 5, and again, it doesn't match. I have the two edges, but here I get the third edge. So these two graphs are not isomorphic, right? And essentially, this is a very hard problem, and the way people solve it is essentially using some kind of brute force search, right? Where you take a node, map it to some other node, and then you keep mapping until you can, and then you backtrack and try mapping again. And if you find a good, the mapping that maps the two graphs perfectly, then you have found isomorphic graphs. So our goal will be that we will first run the ESU algorithm to identify all instances of the subgraphs, and then we will find we will use the graph isomorphism testing to identify all the instances of the topologically the same graph, and this way we can come up with a count. Okay, so that's the idea how to do this. Generally, there are kind of good algorithms out there to do this. All I wanted to show is to give you some flavor. How would you do this yourself, right? You could do this with kind of a greedy, a recursive algorithm that tries to find this mapping until it gets stuck, and then it backtracks and tries again, and eventually it would either exhaust all the options or it would find the mapping, and then you would know the two graphs are isomorphic. Okay? Good. So now I've done the top thing, and now I want to talk about the second part of the lecture, which is this notion of structural roles in networks. Okay? So, structural roles. The idea here is the following, is that roles, you can think of them as functions of nodes in a network. So, you could think that different roles of species what are different roles of species in the ecosystem? Or what are different roles of individuals in organizations or companies, right? So if you have these types of food webs, right, where basically there is an edge from the food source to the animal that is kind of consuming that food source, that creates a directed graph. And you could imagine that different types of animals have different roles in these ecosystems. Or if you think of different companies, again, people have different roles, right? There are sales managers, and there are, supporting teams, and there's finance. And the question is, could I identify the roles of nodes based on their network structure, right? So the way we want to think of these roles is that they are measured based on the network structure around the node, right? Are you a center of a star? Are you a member of a fully connected graph, so a clique? Are you a peripheral node somewhere on the edge of the network, and so on? So this is what we think by roles. Okay? Go show you a few examples. Here is a graph where nodes are colored based on different roles, and the descriptions of the roles are up here. So for example, red nodes are kind of centers of the stars. Circular nodes, these blue ones here, are members of the cliques. These are nodes that are all fully connected with each other. And then, the triangles are kind of peripheral nodes. These are nodes that are kind of just with one or a few connection, generally to the center of the star. So what we would like to do is we would like to have a method that identifies these types of roles and then assigns each node to a role. Okay, that's intuitively the task, right? So what I want to do now is I want to quickly draw the distinction between the notion of a role versus notion of a group. All right, so a role is a collection of nodes in the network that have similar position in the network, but these nodes may not be connected with each other, which is very different from this notion of network communities, which are nodes that are densely connected to each other, and they are members of the same group or of the same community. So the idea is that nodes with the same role do not need to be connected to each other. They may be in different graphs or different parts of the same graph, right? So to elaborate on this a bit more, roles are groups of nodes that have similar structure of networks around them, while communities or groups are groups of nodes that are tightly connected with each other. And the notion of roles and communities are two complementary concepts. Today I'll talk about roles. In the future lectures, we will talk about communities. Right, so if you think about, let's say, a social network of the Stanford Computer Science Department, then structural roles could be faculty, staff, students, right? Staff, an admin has a very certain structure of their social network. Faculty have a certain structure of their social network. Students have a typical structure of the social network. But then, for example, communities or groups inside the computer science department could be the AI lab group, the info lab group, the theory lab group that is composed of people with different roles. To give you another example, here is the same network where in one network nodes are colored based on the structural role, and in the other network nodes are colored based on the group membership. Right? You see kind of that nodes that are close together are colored with the same color. Here, nodes that have similar structure of their network neighborhood are colored with the same color, even though these nodes can be in very different parts of the network. So what I wanted to do is just distinguish between structural roles from this notion of clusters or communities in networks. And we'll talk about this in the future. Today we are talking about this thing. So let me tell you how to define a role more formally. And this is actually a concept coming from social network analysis from 1970s. And the idea is that there is this notion of structural equivalence, where it said that nodes U and V are structurally equivalent if they have the same relationships to all other nodes, right? So structurally equivalent nodes are likely to be similar in many different ways. And in our case, for example, nodes U and V would be structurally equivalent because they both link to the same people in exactly the same way, right? So we would say nodes U and V are structurally equivalent. Notice that the way the definition is up here, it's very restrictive because it says if they have the same relationships to all other nodes, right? Here means to nodes A, B, C, D, and E, right? But nodes U and V are structurally equivalent. And here's another example where you can take the graph and ask what nodes here are structurally equivalent, and you know, nodes 3 and 4 are structurally equivalent, and nodes 1 and 2 are structurally equivalent, because they link in the same way to the rest of the network. Okay? So this is, in some sense, what we would like to discover is these types of equivalence groups, but rather than defining this so rigidly to not allow any variability in the degree and how these edges go, we will allow for some kind of noise in this. So we will discover these things using clustering. Okay? That's the idea. So let me show you how to do this. So these roles will be important because they will allow us to identify what are different properties or of the nodes that we have in our network, and it will will allow us to basically do what is called the role transfer, where we can label a new network given the roles from some other network. We can identify how roles of a given network, a given node, change over time. We can identify outlier roles. We could identify, you know, a role of a fraudster in a social network and things like that. So there is a lot of different applications of this thing. But the method I'll talk about is called RoleX, which is automatic discovery of node structural roles in networks. And this will be an unsupervised approach without any prior knowledge will be needed. And it will assign a node to a mixture of roles. And it will discover both the roles as well as the membership of the nodes to those roles, right? And the idea will be that on the input we will have, I don't know, a graph or a set of graphs, and on the output we will identify the roles and we will assign nodes to those roles. Here roles are indicated with colors. Okay? So that's essentially the idea. And the way the approach will go, it will go over these different steps. On the input we will get a network, the adjacency matrix, and what we will do is, in the first step, is we will create a kind of a descriptor for every node. And this descriptor will be created recursively. I will show you how. And after that, those descriptors are created, we will now have a different matrix where the number of rows will be number of nodes and number of columns will be number of these features that are part of the descriptor of every node. And after we have this matrix, we will then do role extraction, where we will get two things out. We will get assignment of nodes to the roles, and then we'll also have definition of a role through these features. Okay, so we get two things. We discover the roles, and we discover how to assign nodes to the roles. What I want to do first is to tell you about this. How do we do this node to feature matrix? Okay? And the idea will be that I will have the network as the input, and then the number of rows of this feature matrix will be the number of nodes in the network, and the number of columns will be the number of different features, right? And the idea will be that these features, as I move to the right, they will kind of summarize bigger and bigger portions of the network. So, you know, the first few will be about just the node and its local neighbor structure. Then it will be about kind of the nearby neighborhood. And then it will be something about further out. One thing I want to define here is also the notion of the ego network or of the egonet. And an ego network is simply, if you have a node, it's a network composed of the node, its neighbors, and the edges between them, right? In social sciences, the center node is called ego, and the ego network is a network between of the edges between the node and all of its neighbors, right? And also the connections between them, okay? So the first thing we will do is we will just take the node, its neighbors, and we will try to come up with some kind of features that describe the node and its neighbors. Then at the second level, we will try to characterize the structure of this ego network. And then we will kind of unfold this recursively. Okay, and I will explain what do I mean by recursively. Okay, so the idea of recursive feature extraction is that we want to aggregate features from a node and turn them into new features, right? And the idea will be that this is based on a on features of the neighbors of a given node, right? So first we will define a set of local features of a node, which are some kind of measures of the degree of the node, right? So if the graph is directed, this could be in and out degree and total degree. If the graph is weighted, maybe this is the weighted degree, and so on and so forth. Okay, these are the base features. Then I will also create the notion of the ego network features, where I'm not just taking the node and the edges it has out, but I'm also taking the edges between the neighbors or friends of a given node, right? This is called an ego network. And then I can, for example, compute two new features, which is the number of edges that go between the friends. So this would be within ego network edges. I can also say how many edges are entering the ego network, how many edges are leaving the ego network, and so on and so forth. Okay? So now what I have described is the node, its degree, and then the structure of this ego network, which is basically the network one hop away from the node. Now I will do this recursive feature extraction. So the way the recursive part will work is that we will start with a base set of features and then use the set of current node features to generate additional node features. And the way these additional node features will be generated is by using different aggregation functions. And in particular, I will use the min and the sum aggregator functions, right? So the idea will be that, for example, I will take the mean value of the degree of all the neighbors of a given node. So this will be what is the mean degree of my neighbors, or what is the sum of the degrees of my neighbors, right? And essentially, I can do this to compute these means and sums over all the current features, including the recursive features, right? So I can keep kind of running this, and I get richer and richer description around the node. One practical consideration is that the number of possible features will grow exponentially with the number of hops that we go away from the starting node. And to reduce the total number of features, various kinds of pruning techniques can be used, where basically we can identify that certain features are very correlated, and if they are very correlated, we throw them away. Okay? And this way we can eliminate many of them, and we keep the size of this node to feature matrix to be manageable. Okay? Another way how we could do this is that you could do this, but rather than using this recursive feature generation, you could use some kind of graphlet degree vector representation for every node. That would work as well. The original paper here decided to do it through this recursive feature generation. But you could also use graphlet representations, and you could even use this kind of recursive expansion over the graphlet representations. It would actually be very interesting to see what happens. Maybe that's a better idea than what these authors did, actually. Okay? So now what we have learned is how to take the network, how to apply the recursive feature extraction to basically get this node to feature matrix. And then, as the last step, what you can do, sorry, I'm not sure. What you can do is then cluster these nodes based on the extracted features. And you can use here any clustering technique you like, but where you are basically defining some kind of similarity between two nodes based on the description, based on this feature description that they have. You could apply k-means, you could apply some more advanced clustering technique. In this paper, they decided to use non-negative matrix factorization, which is a method we'll talk about later in the class. And essentially, then based on these clusters and these cluster memberships, you assign each node to the role which is the cluster they belong to. And that allows you to identify these types of structural roles in networks. And to give you one example of these types of thing in the last 2 minutes, let me just give you one example, right? The goal here is cluster nodes based on their structural similarity. And we will have two networks, network of science co-authorships, where nodes are scientists and edges are co-authored publications. And the other one will be network of political books and how these different political books are co-purchased. So every node will be a book on Amazon, and edges will be number of people who buy the two books together simultaneously as part of the same basket. Right? And then how are we going to do this? For each of the two networks, we will use this Rolex method, so recursive feature extraction and clustering, to assign each node to a set of discovered structural roles. And then we can look at the similarity between the nodes comparing their roles. And here is an example. This is the network. This is the co-authorship network. And this is exactly what I showed you before. The three roles that the method found were the roles of cliques of authors. These are big papers that people write together. These kind of centers of stars. You could think of them as professors or advisors who work with a lot of their students. And then, the green nodes could be students. These are these little periphery nodes that only write papers with their advisors. So they have blue circles, which is blue nodes that are tightly knit communities, red nodes that are kind of bridges and centers of stars, gray rectangles is kind of everything else, and green are these nodes that are parts of long paths. This is the picture, and here is the similarity between different roles, right? So I have 4 different roles, and what this matrix tries to show is how distinct are these roles from each other. And you see that most of these numbers are very low, except the ones kind of on diagonal, which means that, for example, the blue circles this is a very tightly defined role of people in the clique. While, for example, there is bigger diversity, for example, in gray nodes, which is all the other nodes of the network. So this is what I wanted to show in terms of co-authorship network. I also show you an example of the co-purchasing network of books, but you guys can go and check that yourself. So with this, I'm happy to finish the lecture. If you have any questions, please come here and I'll be happy to answer them.